the transferred feast of the Ugandan martyrs, which is displaced by St. Kevin on the 3rd in Ireland, reminds us how there is a continuity between the generations and the centuries. St. Paul VI pointed that out when canonizing St. Charles Lwanga and his companions. There is a full circle. The Church of St. Augustine, the Cilician martyrs, the martyrs of Carthage in North Africa, the martyrs even of Egypt, these are all one in the great cloud of witnesses. And the torments, tortures, and martyrdom undergone by these more recent saints, for reasons actually very contemporary, are to be indicated for our times as actually a testimony to be taken seriously. They were not willing to get involved with impure acts with the king of the area. Some were in his inner court, and he thought he could get away with anything, but with the Christians he couldn't, and they made a stand, and the consequences for them were atrocious. They are feasted with great solemnity down there in Uganda on this day at the shrine, and one sees how in that culture there is an authentic inculturation going on. The Spirit uses and harnesses what is best of a local culture. It happens also in our time. I remember actually at the last Welsh Mass I assisted at before going into the monastic life in 1976, I had two close friends with me there, both English. One at least was ordained afterwards and became a priest. In fact, he became advisor to Cardinal Hume on things ecumenical. A great preacher and a maker of converts. They used to call his converts seedlings because his name was Seed, vital seed. Well, he said sometime after the last Mass we'd had together there, the Welsh Mass, I cried at that last hymn. I was quite surprised. He just said that last hymn was just too much for me, because what we took for granted he didn't. They just went into harmony automatically and created natural beauty with the harmonics there of the human voice, instinctive to the Welsh spirit. And so it is that the Spirit of God uses what is there, and it should be so. It doesn't always work, however, when one culture tries to invade another. We have to be respectful of what is there and not insist on our own mode, delicacy and respect for what we find. That actually can happen both ways round. For instance, if people from other countries come to our own. With regard to the specific genius of the African peoples, it is interesting to see how the Spirit of God works therein. At St. Antimo, at one point we had actually quite a few from Africa in formation in the novitiate. Some of these countries are French in culture and in language, that is the language of culture down there, and so it's very easy sometimes to have that bridge. The only thing is that it doesn't quite work out so simply because they're bringing their culture and it's a very different one from what they find in Europe, even though the community might be French speaking. However, we did have some interesting experiences. When it came to liturgy, they had an instinct. They were very dignified, always. Anything to do with the liturgy, they had natural bearing and decorum, which was quite edifying. They did things well, physically. They also had a notion of celebration, and they would have on a Saturday evening in the crypt their own encounter of prayer and singing, and they would go into African mode, which was quite interesting. Also, before class, they would instinctively sing. They would have a different one each time. Great was their repertoire as the opening prayer. And then in conversation, one would listen to this one or that one, and they would come out with things which were quite fascinating. One who was about 19 at the time, on Sunday afternoon, while I was talking to him, came out with things like this: that in his village, a priest had been up to no good, presumably misbehaving, and he was celebrating sacred mysteries, and when it came to the final doxology, which he was singing in French, he had to stop short, because in his hands the sacred host had become visible flesh and blood. And I asked him calmly what kind of flesh, and he said, Negro flesh. So the Lord was identifying himself with his people. And he also told how there had been a young lassie who had wanted to make her first communion, but her father was pagan. In the end he allowed her to, but he did ask her to get hold of what those Christians had and bring it to her. She was frightened of her father and did actually get hold of the sacred host, something which is now made more easy, unfortunately, by communion in the hand. So her father used it as a kind of fetish for good luck and nailed it to the wall, and immediately upon nailing it, the sacred host bled copiously, and there was blood all over the place, and of course had to be made known to the church authorities, and so it became known as a Eucharistic miracle, that one too. And when in France, in the mid-80s, we were following through what was happening in Rwanda, actually 10 years before there was going to be a terrible outbreak of violence and war there. But it was Our Lady appearing at Kibeho, and it was actually approved locally, and it was something which was in their mode. Heaven was operating as it would for Africans. It was more interesting as regards the exterior bodily movements and drama that was involved. It might be in Europe. And we saw there precisely how heaven respects the culture of the area, operates therein. Indeed, there was one of the 7 young people involved who was actually a pagan. He was the one boy, the others were girls, and his name was Emmanuel, and he was taught the faith by the Lord himself, by Our Lady, I think. And it was interesting to find actually how there the Lord didn't have any obstacle in getting through, for instance, a barrage of heavy self-sufficient intellectualism which reasoned out heaven because earth was sufficient. No, people were listening. And I was fascinated myself, and while it was ongoing, I went to the scriptorium and wrote this about what was going on there, especially about the clear warning that we actually have to take account of the fact that our time is not as long as we think. Sin has its consequences, and these were told, especially to Emmanuel, as warnings for us all. Sin leads to an awful place, and time is running short. And yet again, dear Mother, dost thou call, this time with greater force than e'er before. Thy kindly words, once more, in vain did fall on clever European ears. No more can we rely on mercy now. White maid, betake thyself to other skies, thy feet depose on more receptive soil. Afraid no longer to become so indiscreet as to be caught, nay, in the very act of gossiping with natives in their tongue, at length, as though to take count of the fact of lengthiness in lands where time is long. Or so they thought, or so we thought, or so we will no doubt think on until we know.